A powerful judge thought he could humiliate Pam Bondi in open court, but just minutes later, he was the one in handcuffs. What happened inside that courtroom shocked the entire nation and exposed a truth no one saw coming. This is a story you won't forget. You don't belong in this courtroom, Ms. Bondi. The judge's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporters paused mid-typing. All eyes turned toward the woman standing near the back, Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General. Dressed in a modest suit, she had entered quietly, hoping to observe the proceedings of a case that had caught her attention. But now, all attention was on her. Pam stood still, composed, but visibly stunned. That wasn't just a statement. It was an attack, a public insult in a room full of witnesses. And it came from Judge Harold Watkins, a man known as much for his ruthless rulings as for the fear he instilled in everyone around him. Pam hadn't come there to stir trouble. The case involved a young single mother accused of embezzling funds from the small business where she worked. But everything about the case smelled wrong. No concrete evidence, a rushed indictment, and a public defender who looked defeated before the trial even began. Pam had seen enough shady prosecutions in her career to recognize one when it appeared. So she quietly took a seat, hoping to observe, maybe offer support. She wasn't part of the legal team. She wasn't even at the defense table. But her presence alone seemed to set off something in Judge Watkins. He pointed at her with one hand, barely trying to hide the scorn in his voice. You think your name gives you special treatment here? You're not on this case. This isn't your stage. The courtroom collectively held its breath. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Loud, harsh, disrespectful. Not the tone of a judge addressing a former top law enforcement officer, but like a man trying to humiliate a woman in public and make her feel small. Pam didn't react. Not visibly. Her face was unreadable. But something in her eyes flickered. A quiet fire. The kind that didn't shout but planned. A camera crew in the back had been filming for a local news piece. They caught every second. The judge's voice. The silence that followed. The tension in the air. Then, without a word, Pam picked up her notebook, stood tall, and walked out of the courtroom. Dignified, graceful, but burning on the inside. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried to ask her what had happened. She didn't answer. She just got into her car, closed the door, and took a deep breath. Then she pulled out her phone and made one call. I need everything you can find on Judge Harold Watkins. Unsealed, sealed complaints, rumors. I want all. Tonight, what the judge and the public didn't know was that Pam Bondi had spent her entire career fighting injustice. From drug kingpins to political corruption, she'd built a reputation for exposing the truth, no matter how powerful the enemy. She wasn't afraid of robes, titles, or courtrooms. She was afraid of silence in the face of wrongdoing. And this time she had just been given a front row seat to something rotten. Back in her office that evening, files started flooding in. Old complaints, disciplinary reports that had been quietly dismissed, whispers from attorneys who had gone up against Watkins and had mysteriously lost their licenses. There were stories of bias, harassment, even bribes disguised as gifts. The deeper Pam looked, the more it all connected. Watkins had ruled with unchecked power for years. His record was protected by the very system he controlled. Every complaint had been buried, every whisper silenced. No one had dared challenge him, until now. Pam stared at the final document that landed in her inbox, an internal memo from 5 years ago. A female attorney had accused Judge Watkins of inappropriate conduct. The case had been resolved internally, and the file sealed. Pam knew what that meant. It was never about her being in that courtroom. It was about control. Watkins had seen her as a threat, someone who couldn't be bullied, and he had tried to tear her down publicly. He had failed. As Pam looked out her window at the city lights, she knew one thing for sure. Judge Harold Watkins had just made the worst mistake of his life, because now Pam Bondi was watching, and she never watched for long before taking action. Pam Bondi wasn't just any former attorney general. She was a storm wrapped in silk. To the outside world, she might have looked like a polished public servant, but those who knew her history understood This woman was a fighter. From battling drug cartels in Florida to dismantling billion-dollar corporate scams, Pam had earned her reputation the hard way. She didn't just walk into courtrooms. She walked in with purpose and left with results. Whether it was going head-to-head with shady politicians or protecting victims of fraud, one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had never been afraid of power, and certainly not afraid of someone like Judge Harold Watkins. As she sat quietly in her car after the courtroom humiliation, the moment replayed in her mind on loop, not because she was hurt by the insult. She had thick skin, but because of what it revealed. That wasn't a personal jab. That was a warning, a threat, a territorial growl from a man used to being untouchable in his courtroom. Judge Watkins didn't just see Pam as an observer. He saw her as a danger to the game he'd been playing for years. Pam's fingers hovered for only a second before dialing. I need access to Judge Harold Watkins' disciplinary history. Everything, sealed, unsealed, rumors, red flags. Right now, she wasn't playing games. And the people on the other end of the line knew it. Within minutes, her private network kicked into motion. Old colleagues at the DOJ, state ethics officials, court clerks who owed her favors. Files began landing in her inbox, one after the other. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. There were formal complaints from attorneys, buried deep in archives. 3 cases of alleged judicial bias, dismissed with no explanation. An internal ethics report from 2 years ago, warning about inconsistent rulings and preferential treatment towards certain prosecutors. That report had never seen the light of day. Pam scrolled faster, heart pounding. Then she saw the ones that made her stop cold. A female prosecutor from a neighboring county had filed a confidential complaint against Watkins 6 years earlier. Her words were chilling. I was belittled, mocked, and threatened in open court. I believe it was personal. I believe he wanted to make an example of me. It was almost identical to what Pam had just experienced. That woman had left her position shortly after the complaint was resolved internally. Pam leaned back in her seat, staring at the dashboard. This wasn't a one-time outburst. This was a pattern. A dirty, dangerous pattern. It wasn't just about bad courtroom behavior. It was about abuse of power. A man sitting at the highest seat in the room, who believed he could twist justice to his will and crush anyone who challenged him. The more Pam connected the dots, the clearer it became. Watkins had ruled unchecked for years. No oversight, no consequences, no one bold enough to take him on. Until now, and the cameras had caught it all. The very next day, Judge Harold Watkins walked into the courthouse like he owned it. Dressed in his usual black robe, face stern and shoulders back, he exuded arrogance, as if the world outside hadn't just erupted in scandal, as if his name wasn't plastered across every major news channel, as if Pam Bondi hadn't just delivered a public knockout blow to his once untouchable reputation. His staff walked behind him, quiet and nervous. His usual clerk wouldn't even make eye contact. But Watkins, he marched into the courtroom like nothing had changed. The room was already packed. Media crews lined the back, their cameras rolling silently. Spectators filled the gallery. Some were there out of curiosity, some out of hope. A few defense attorneys stood in tense silence, watching him with unreadable expressions. In the very back of the room, Pam Bondi stood with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the bench. She wore no smug smile, no air of revenge. She wasn't here for drama. She was here for justice. And it came quickly, just as Judge Watkins reached his bench. The heavy wooden doors at the back creaked open again. 2 men in dark suits entered the courtroom. Their footsteps were slow, deliberate. The silver badges on their belts caught the light. U.S. Marshals. The room turned to stone. The air grew thick. You could hear a pin drop. The marshals approached the front of the room. Watkins, confused, raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he said, trying to keep control of his voice. But they didn't hesitate. "Judge Harold Watkins," one marshal said loudly and clearly, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and tampering with legal proceedings. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man in the jury box shook his head in disbelief. Watkins' face turned pale. He blinked rapidly. His lips parted, but no words came out. He stepped back instinctively as if trying to run, but the marshals were already beside him. He stuttered. This is absurd. I'm a sitting judge. You can't. One of the marshals cut him off. Sir, step down. Now! They weren't asking. He hesitated for a beat longer, then finally removed his robe, revealing a crisp white shirt underneath, now damp with sweat. The courtroom watched, silent and stunned, as the marshals turned him around and slipped handcuffs over his wrists. Click, click. Pam watched from the back. Still no smile. Still no satisfaction on her face. Just quiet resolve. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about accountability. About a man who had used the law like a weapon finally being forced to face it himself. As the judge was escorted out, reporters flooded the hallway outside. The story would break within seconds. Headlines would scream. Judge arrested in courtroom, caught by his own system. As Watkins disappeared down the hallway, his legacy crumbled with every step. Everything he had built on fear, intimidation, and secrecy was now exposed to the light. The courtroom remained frozen. No one knew what to say. Some were stunned. Some relieved. A few, quietly, even applauded. Pam slowly stepped out into the hallway, ignoring the press frenzy. A reporter called out to her, "Pam, how do you feel now that he's been arrested?" She paused for a second, then answered softly, "Justice doesn't always come quickly. But when it does, it speaks for everyone who didn't have a voice." That was all she said. She didn't need to say more. The image of a judge being taken down in his own courtroom, by the very system he once ruled over, said everything. And now, that courtroom wouldn't be remembered for his rulings or his authority. It would be remembered as a place where justice stood up and corruption sat down. The very next day, Judge Harold Watkins walked into the courthouse like he owned the air around him. The morning sun poured through the marble columns of the courthouse steps as he ascended them, head high, black robe flowing behind him like a cape. To anyone watching, it looked like a man still in control, but it was all performance. His walk was deliberate. His jaw was clenched. Every step echoed confidence. But underneath that cold, controlled exterior was a man in denial, desperate to maintain an illusion that had already shattered. Watkins had seen the headlines, of course. He couldn't ignore them. His name had been blasted across every major network, every newspaper, every trending feed on social media. Corrupt judge faces investigation. Pam Bondi speaks out. Whistleblowers erupt against Florida judge. The media storm was relentless. But still, he came back, not because he was brave, not because he was innocent, because he believed he was untouchable. For over 2 decades, Watkins had ruled his courtroom like a king. His voice was law, his glare enough to silence seasoned attorneys. He had made and broken legal careers. And in all those years, no one had ever dared to publicly challenge him, until Pam Bondi stood up. And now, cameras followed his every move. As he entered the courthouse lobby, the atmosphere was tense and quiet. Security guards gave him stiff nods. Clerks paused mid-conversation. Even the janitor looked away. His usual courtroom assistant, Rebecca, walked behind him carrying a stack of case files. She had worked with him for 6 years, but today, she didn't speak a word. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Watkins noticed. Everyone was behaving differently. The invisible walls of respect that once surrounded him, they were gone. But still, he pressed on. He adjusted his robe with a swift motion and pushed through the heavy courtroom doors like a man entering a battlefield. The room was half full, but it felt electric. News cameras were set up at the back. Journalists with notepads and digital recorders lined the benches. Local attorneys filled the seats, whispering behind their hands. Some were here to watch the trial schedule for the day. Others were simply there to see what would happen to the judge everyone feared, but no longer respected. Watkins made no eye contact. He walked straight to his bench, adjusted his chair, and sat down like nothing had happened. But everything had. He cleared his throat and looked at the docket. "Let's proceed with the first matter for the day," he said, voice crisp, commanding, as if he still held all the cards. But no one responded right away. Even the attorneys in the room hesitated, waiting for the storm. Pam Bondi wasn't in the room yet, but everyone knew she was coming. Or maybe she was watching from somewhere nearby. After all, she was the one who had set all of this in motion. Pam Bondi, the woman he tried to embarrass in front of cameras. The woman he dismissed as a guest in his courtroom. The woman he mocked, believing she would walk away quietly. But she hadn't. And now, she had torn the mask off his legacy. Behind the scenes, Watkins had spent the previous night calling in favors. He had spoken to colleagues, tried to pressure old allies, even hinted at retaliation. But none of it worked. No one wanted to be associated with him now. Not with federal agents circling. Not with the Judicial Oversight Board breathing down his neck. Not with the internet ablaze with stories from people he had silenced. Still, he sat on the bench, forcing the illusion to continue. The clerk finally read the first case. An awkward silence followed. Everyone was waiting for something, though they weren't quite sure what. The video from the courtroom. Watkins shouting, the gas from the crowd, Pam's silent exit, had already begun circulating. Someone had leaked it online. Views were climbing fast. The public was talking. Pam knew what this meant. She wasn't going to walk away and forget it ever happened. She wasn't going to send a polite letter to the ethics board or quietly whisper about it in legal circles. She was going to make it known, loud, clear, and legal, but she also knew better than to rush. This wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about protecting justice itself. She picked up her phone again. Get me everything from the Judicial Oversight Committee archives. If there's even one piece of evidence they overlooked or ignored, I want it in my hands by morning. This time, she wasn't just fighting for that young mother on trial. She was fighting for every lawyer silenced, every case mishandled, and every person denied justice by a man who thought the bench gave him a license to rule like a king. Pam Bondi didn't need a robe to bring justice. She had something far more powerful, the truth, and now she had the evidence to prove it. The sun had barely risen when Pam Bondi arrived at the courthouse the next morning, but this time, she wasn't here to watch quietly from the back row. She stood tall and determined, not inside the courtroom, but outside on the courthouse steps, surrounded by flashing cameras and a sea of reporters. Microphones pointed in every direction, news vans lined the street, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Pam took a breath and stepped up to the podium. Her voice was steady, her gaze fierce. Yesterday, I was insulted not as Pam Bondi, but as every woman, every attorney, and every citizen who has ever stood up for justice. What happened inside that courtroom wasn't just an outburst. It was a warning from a man who has ruled without accountability for too long. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Some people passing by even stopped on the sidewalk to listen. Today, she continued, I am filing formal charges of judicial misconduct against Judge Harold Watkins, and I'm turning over new evidence to federal investigators that shows a clear pattern of corruption, abuse of power, and unethical behavior from a bench. And just like that, the media exploded. Within an hour, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Footage from the courtroom the day before, Watkins yelling, the crowd gasping Pam's silent exit, had gone viral overnight. Millions had viewed it on social media. Pam's press conference was now trending worldwide. But what came next shocked even Pam. People started speaking up. Anonymous emails poured in, direct messages, tweets, posts, videos, former defendants, retired attorneys, court clerks, even jurors. One by one, they shared disturbing stories of their own encounters with Judge Watkins. Stories that were eerily similar to Pam's experience. Cases rushed through, evidence ignored, defense attorneys belittled, questionable rulings made behind closed doors. A former legal assistant wrote in an anonymous post. He used to scream at young lawyers in chambers, especially women. I was told to never question him, or I'd lose my job. Another anonymous tip came from a man claiming he was pressured into a guilty plea under Watkins' bench after being denied access to key evidence. Within just a few hours, The Judicial Oversight Board had received more complaints about Judge Watkins than they had about any judge in the last year. Combined, Pam wasn't surprised. She had expected this. The only reason these voices had remained silent was because no one had ever dared to challenge him publicly. But now, someone had, and that spark of courage had become a wildfire. But Pam wasn't done. Not even close. Behind the scenes, she had already compiled a massive case file. Years of buried misconduct, closed-door settlements, and disciplinary reports that had mysteriously vanished. She had names of silenced attorneys, dates of questionable verdicts, and even evidence of a secret financial tie between Watkins and a high-profile defense firm that had won every case in his courtroom for the last 5 years. Pam delivered the entire file, digitally and physically, to 2 key places, the state attorney's office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a full-scale federal investigation. Agents began reviewing court transcripts. Old cases were reopened. Subpoenas were drafted. A special task force was assigned to look into Watkins' financial records. Even the governor's office made a public statement. "We are monitoring the Watkins investigation closely. No official in the state is above the law." Pam didn't celebrate. She wasn't doing this for attention. She barely gave interviews after the press conference. Her mission was clear: hold Judge Watkins accountable, and make sure this never happens again. The young single mother whose case she had originally come to observe, her trial was paused indefinitely pending review. And Watkins, he hadn't made a public statement. He hadn't appeared in court since the video went viral. But Pam knew he was watching. He was watching the headlines, watching the social media firestorm, watching as his power slipped through his fingers, one complaint, one witness, one brave voice at a time. Pam Bondi had done more than file a complaint. She had broken a wall of silence. And behind that wall was a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. But now, the truth had a spotlight, and Pam was holding the light. But Watkins felt it in his gut. The ground beneath him had shifted. The power he once wielded so easily had vanished like smoke. His title still sat next to his nameplate, but the weight behind it had evaporated. This wasn't a return to normal. This was the calm before justice arrived. And deep down, for the first time in his career, Harold Watkins felt it: fear. The kind of fear that comes when a man who lived above the law suddenly realizes the law is coming for him. Ending Yeti Ek or Kahani, Joe Chupiti Sapi Nazarsi, SKWAD, Stories Kuwo and Ardare. Subscribe Karo or Ask Kahani and Kares Podcast.